everyone, today we will be talking about the role of women in early jazz. Despite their importance to the genre as a whole, not much is really known or discussed about women in early jazz music. From having their own all-girl bands to leading and fronting mixed-gender bands, women have been at the forefront of jazz since the very beginning.
In the early days of jazz, it was hard for women to be accepted by male band leaders and musicians as being equally talented, and harder to find opportunities to play. They often formed all-girl bands, the most famous being the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, a group of 17 integrated young women who traveled the country playing jazz during the late 30s and through the 40s. These young women played in a primarily black theater and club network, and also spent a lot of time entertaining troops in Europe at the USO. The band is known for their dynamic blues playing and unique riffs. While a lot of their recordings have not been preserved, much of their playing for the armed forces broadcasts have been kept. The band included members such as Pauline Brady, a standout drummer known for her solos and hard swing, and trumpet player Cora Bryant, a talented bebop player with unbelievable range and creativity. In early jazz, women were mostly accepted as being singers or piano players, and were not as welcomed on other instruments. Women like saxophonist Peggy Gilbert helped to break that barrier. Starting off as directing an all-woman band in the 20s, she continued to organize and lead bands and ensembles through the 1930s, which appeared in motion pictures and played in famous ballrooms and hotels. She was not only the actual leader and manager, but also always performed with her groups, and took charge of the look and sound of the bands. She was an extremely strong advocate for women instrumentalists throughout the 1930s. Trombonist, arranger, and composer Melba Liston became a professional musician at the Los Angeles Lincoln Theater at age 16. During her time with the Lincoln Theater Band, she began composing and arranging for the variety of acts that came to the theater. Later in her life, she joined Dizzy Gillespie's big band, in which she arranged songs such as My Reverie and Stella by Starlight. Another extremely talented lady of early jazz was Anne Pont, often referred to as the female Artie Shaw, who lived in a time where musicians like Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw were the kings of swing. She is famously known for forming and fronting an all-male band called Anne Pont and her 12 music men. She had a wild, uninhibited style of playing the clarinet and was welcomed in hotels, clubs, and venues all across New York. The rhythm section was a place that fostered many talented women pianists, guitarists, bass players, and drummers. Some of the most well-known piano players include Lil Hardin Armstrong and Terry Pollard, who played the vibes as well as the keys. Lil Hardin was a respected composer, pianist, and bandleader, who began her work with prominent black bands in Chicago during the 1920s. She surprised musicians all around her with her immense talent, and she spent her time playing in King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. Her deep knowledge of music and experience made her one of the most influential and talented musicians and composers in jazz history. Mary Osborne was a guitarist and a guitar manufacturer who was part of the 1940s jazz scene in New York City, playing with musicians such as Dizzy Gillespie, Art Tatum, Coleman Hawkins, and Thelonious Monk. She learned to play jazz from sitting in with other musicians and made a name for herself by playing wherever she could across New York. Like Osborne, bassist Vivien Garry was active in the 1940s jazz scene in both New York and Los Angeles. She had a well-known all-girl band, who was known to swing very hard and interpret classics very creatively. She played with trumpetist Edna Williams and had a fiery, driving sound to her band. They played at top jazz nightclubs all across New York, and she was one of the only very well-known female bass players of that time in New York. The Boswell Sisters were amongst the first female jazz vocal groups to exist, and were extremely influential on artists such as Ella Fitzgerald. They grew up in New Orleans during the early years of jazz, incorporating tight harmonies, scat singing, instrumental imitations, and even tempo changes within their recordings. They had a natural feel for hot jazz and swing, which was rare to find among white singers of the era, and they were greatly admired and respected by top musicians around.
But instead I trust him implicitly. He can go where he wants to go, do what he wants to do, I sure don't care. Oh, the object of my affection can change my complexion from white to a rosy red. Anytime he holds my hand and tells me that he's mine. The object of my affection can change my complexion.
The history of women in early jazz would be incomplete without talking about Mary Lou Williams, renowned pianist, arranger, and composer, who began as a child prodigy playing music for family and neighbors. She was performing with big bands at age 12, playing for artists like Jelly Roll Morton, Fats Waller, and Duke Ellington. When she was only 17, she took over the leadership of a big band and began a successful career in arranging. Throughout the 30s, she arranged for musicians like Ellington, Armstrong, Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman, and many others. Throughout the 1940s, she was a mentor for early bebop musicians, and has always been a leading figure for women in jazz. Her work and influence will always be remembered. I hope that you learned more about women in early jazz, and thanks for watching.